The grand estate stood like a relic from a bygone era, nestled amidst the sprawling cityscape of New York. Its architecture, a blend of classical elegance with a touch of modern refinement, spoke of decades of wealth and power. For James, it was not just a house, but a lifetime of hard work, sacrifice, and achievement. At 70, he had seen the world change around him, but his home had always been a constant. He'd built this life from the ground up, starting as a humble man in a small town before making a name for himself in the business world. His hands, now trembling with age, had once been capable of sealing countless deals, signing papers that changed the course of his life. Today, however, they trembled for another reason: a piece of paper that would soon be signed, the most important signature of his life. He sat at the head of an antique wooden desk, the faint smell of polished oak filling the air. The room around him was dimly lit, the heavy curtains drawn tight to block the setting sun. The only sound was the ticking of an old grandfather clock in the corner, its rhythmic ticking a constant companion to his quiet thoughts. Before him sat a single document, the legal language flowing across the page in neat, meticulous lines. Karen, his wife of 40 years, stood beside him, her presence as familiar as the house itself. She had always been by his side, a constant in the ever-changing world. But today, something was different. She didn't look at him with the same warmth that had once filled their marriage. Her eyes were distant, avoiding his gaze, as if the woman he had known for so many years had somehow slipped away into someone unrecognizable. She was, as always, graceful and poised, her silver hair swept into a neat chignon. But there was an edge to her demeanor, an uncertainty that hung in the air like a cloud. "James, please," she said, her voice soft, almost too sweet. "We're getting older, and managing everything together just doesn't make sense anymore. I've been thinking about this for a while. Let's sign the paperwork, transfer the property and assets into my name. It's the simplest solution to avoid inheritance taxes down the line. After all, we don't need to worry about the house and investments anymore. We've built enough for the kids. Let's make this easy." Her words hung in the air, and James, trusting her completely, nodded without a second thought. He had always been a man of action, someone who believed in the strength of family and loyalty. And Karen had always been his partner in every sense. There was no reason to doubt her, no reason to question the motives behind her words. The fountain pen in his hand felt heavier than usual as he hesitated for just a moment, staring at the document before him. The weight of a lifetime of decisions pressed on his mind. He had signed many papers in his life, but this felt different. He looked at Karen once more, her soft smile almost convincing him that it was all for the best. After all, they had built everything together. "I trust you, Karen," James said, his voice steady despite the unease gnawing at him. "We've always made decisions together." With a deep breath, he signed his name across the bottom of the page. The pen left its mark on the crisp white paper, sealing not just the transfer of assets, but his future as well. It was a decision made in the name of simplicity, of trust, of love. But little did he know, that single stroke of ink would be the catalyst for a chain of events that would unravel his entire life. Minutes later, as he set the pen down and looked up, Karen smiled and took the paper, folding it neatly before slipping it into her bag. The weight of the moment settled over them both, though it was invisible to James, who still believed in the sincerity of her actions. That evening, as the first few drops of rain began to patter softly against the windows, James stepped outside for a brief walk, trying to clear his mind. The decision weighed heavily on him, but there was nothing to be done. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, and the streets were slick with the fresh rain. The city felt distant, its hum a background noise to the silence that seemed to have settled over him. He strolled through the neighborhood, the rhythmic tapping of his shoes against the wet pavement the only sound in the quiet evening. The lights of the city twinkled in the distance, the skyscrapers looming like silent giants. For a moment, He allowed himself to get lost in the tranquility of the night, hoping the cold air would soothe his troubled thoughts. But when he returned home, his sense of peace was shattered. The grand gate to the estate was closed, and as James approached, he saw something that froze him in his tracks. His suitcase was sitting abandoned on the steps, its leather corners worn from years of use, its contents spilling out onto the wet ground. Panic surged through him as he approached the door, only to find it locked. He knocked urgently, but there was no answer. The lights were dim inside, and the silence that greeted him felt unnatural, as though something was horribly wrong. "Karen," he called out, his voice cracking in the cold night air. His hand shook as he pressed it against the doorbell, but there was no sound. No movement. Nothing. Suddenly, through the frosted glass, he saw them. Karen stood inside, her face calm, but something was off. She wasn't alone. Standing next to her was Mark Young, handsome, and impeccably dressed. The same Mark who had only weeks ago been introduced as a business acquaintance, a friend of the family. "James," Karen said, her voice cold and distant, carrying through the intercom. "I've filed for divorce. It's already been processed. I'm done with this marriage. I've moved on. Mark is my future now." The words hit him like a physical blow. He could barely comprehend them as they echoed in his mind, each syllable a hammer striking his chest. The house, the life he had built, the years they had shared, all of it crumbled before him in that instant. He pounded on the door, his fists bruising from the force, his voice hoarse with desperation. "Karen, please. Don't do this. You can't." But there was no response, only the sound of Karen's indifferent voice, her words final and cutting. "It's over. You should go. You have nothing here anymore." James stood there, rooted to the spot, as the rain continued to fall, washing away the remnants of his dignity. His heart broke as the truth settled in like a heavy weight. This was it. This was the end. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the darkness for some shred of familiarity, but all he could feel was the crushing weight of betrayal. The storm raged on, the world around him a blur of water and shadow, as the door slammed shut behind him, leaving him standing alone in the cold, abandoned and broken. In that moment, James realized the truth. The life he had built, the empire, the family, the love, none of it mattered. All that remained was the raw, exposed reality of what Karen had taken from him, and the knowledge that his world would never be the same again. The rain poured down relentlessly, soaking him through, but James couldn't bring himself to move. His legs felt as heavy as lead, his heart aching with a pain that was both familiar and foreign. He had lost everything in the blink of an eye, and now, as the cold seeped into his bones, he was left to face the bitter truth alone. James had never imagined his life would come to this. For years, he had been a successful businessman, respected in his field, a man of dignity and pride. His name had been synonymous with trust, integrity, and reliability. He had built a legacy, something to leave behind for his children and grandchildren. And yet, here he was standing outside the house he had worked so hard to build, with nothing but the clothes on his back and the remnants of a shattered life. The cold rain that had soaked his clothes felt like a fitting metaphor for the way his life had turned. He had lost everything in one cruel moment, and the sting of that betrayal was as biting as the icy winds that cut through him. He didn't know where to go or who to turn to. He thought about his children, scattered around the world, all of them successful and living their own lives. They wouldn't understand. They wouldn't know how to handle the pain he felt, how the woman he had trusted above all others had crushed him. James couldn't bring himself to reach out to them. It wasn't just the distance that separated them, it was the shame. He had always prided himself on being the protector, the provider, the man who could take care of his family, no matter what. But now, he was a broken man, defeated and abandoned, and he couldn't bring himself to face his children in this state. The last thing he wanted was for them to worry about him, to become entangled in his personal disgrace. His steps grew heavier with each passing block as he wandered aimlessly through the streets, the rain relentlessly drenching him, washing away the remnants of his dignity. The city, once a place of power and opportunity, now felt like a foreign land, a cruel reminder of what he had lost. The world around him moved on, oblivious to his pain, and he was left to drift through it like a ghost, unnoticed and forgotten. As he walked past familiar places where he had once dined with colleagues, where he had made deals and sealed contracts, he felt a deep sense of alienation. The world that had once been his playground had become a prison. It was as if everything he had built was being taken from him, piece by piece, and all he could do was watch helplessly as it crumbled. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten all day. The hunger gnawed at him, a sharp, insistent reminder of his current state. He hadn't known hunger like this in years. He had always had more than enough, lived comfortably, dined at the finest restaurants, never having to worry about where his next meal would come from. Now, the world felt different, darker, more hostile. He found himself standing in front of a small diner, its neon sign flickering in the rain. The warmth that wafted out from the cracked door was inviting, but he hesitated. He had never been the type to beg, to ask for anything from anyone. The thought of sitting in a public place, eating a cheap meal, felt beneath him. He had spent decades eating at the finest restaurants, surrounded by business partners and high-powered executives. But the hunger in his stomach overpowered his pride, and with a deep sigh, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, and for a brief moment, the noise of the rain and the world outside faded away. The small diner was warm, the smell of greasy food filling the air, a stark contrast to the cold that had seeped into his bones. A few people sat at the counter, quietly eating their meals, oblivious to the man who had just entered. He sat at the farthest corner, away from everyone else, his head down, his shoulders hunched in defeat. The waitress, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes, took his order without speaking much, handing him a menu before walking away. James didn't even look at the menu, he just stared at the table, the metal surface reflecting the dim light above. When the waitress returned with his food, he barely noticed her. His eyes were fixed on the plate in front of him, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the knife and fork. The food tasted like nothing, bland, flavorless, just something to fill the emptiness inside him. He ate mechanically, his mind elsewhere, lost in a fog of despair. As he chewed, the sound of laughter from the other side of the diner broke through his thoughts. A group of young children sat at a nearby table, giggling as they played some game with their food. Their laughter, so innocent and carefree, stung James to the core. He couldn't help but think of his own children, of how they would never understand the humiliation he was now experiencing. The laughter of the children turned into teasing when they noticed him sitting alone. One of the boys, no older than 10, pointed at James and laughed. "Look, it's an old man who doesn't have a home. Poor guy," he said, his voice loud and mocking. James' heart sank, and the room seemed to shrink around him. The innocent cruelty of the child's words hit him like a slap in the face. It was the first time in his life he had felt so completely invisible, so utterly worthless. The other children joined in, giggling as they threw bits of food his way, their laughter ringing in his ears like a cruel, mocking chorus. "Look at him. He's a bum," another child shouted. "He doesn't even have shoes." James' face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger, but he did nothing. He couldn't. The humiliation was too much. He had spent his entire life building a reputation, but now, he was nothing more than an old man, a nobody, a target for the cruelty of children who had no understanding of the world he had once ruled. The waitress returned to refill his drink, but James didn't look up. He couldn't. His heart felt heavy, weighed down by the crushing reality of his situation. The plate in front of him remained half-eaten, untouched, just like his life now empty, hollow, and devoid of meaning. As he finished his meal, James felt the familiar sting of tears threatening to break free, but he swallowed them down. He refused to let himself cry. He had never cried in front of anyone, not even his children. Crying would mean admitting defeat, and he wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Instead, he paid for the meal and left the diner, stepping back into the cold night. The rain had intensified, the drops now coming down in sheets, soaking him to the bone. But he didn't care. The cold outside was nothing compared to the chill he felt inside. James wandered the streets, aimlessly walking through the city, trying to outrun the crushing weight of his despair. His body ached, his legs were tired, but he couldn't stop. The thought of stopping, of sitting down and giving in to the darkness, was too much to bear. So he walked. He walked until his feet were sore, until his mind was numb, until he could no longer remember how long it had been since he had felt any hope. As he passed a familiar street corner, he caught sight of a young couple laughing together under an umbrella. The sight of their happiness, their closeness, made something inside him snap. It was the life he had once had, the life he had lost. The darkness that had been creeping at the edges of his consciousness finally consumed him, and for the first time in years, James allowed himself to collapse against the brick wall, his body shaking with the sobs he had been holding in for so long. The rain poured down, mingling with his tears, as he let go of the last shreds of pride that had once defined him. In that moment, he was no longer a businessman. No longer a husband or a father. He was just a man, broken and lost, struggling to find his way in a world that no longer had a place for him. The streets of New York felt even more oppressive that night, the tall buildings casting long, cold shadows across the sidewalks as if the city itself were closing in on James. The rain continued its relentless assault, soaking through his worn-out clothes, drenching him to the bone. But the cold was nothing compared to the chill in his heart. As he walked through the empty streets, he barely noticed the world around him, his mind consumed with thoughts of his betrayal. His footsteps echoed in the night, a constant reminder that he had nowhere to go. The city that had once been a place of promise, of power and opportunity, now seemed like a maze with no exit. It was a foreign land to him now, a place where he was just another anonymous face in the crowd. The laughter of children, the chatter of strangers, it all seemed so distant, like something he could no longer be a part of. He had built this city with his hands, and now it was rejecting him. It wasn't until his legs finally gave out beneath him that he realized how far he had walked. Stumbling to the curb, he sank to the cold ground, his hands trembling, his chest tight with the weight of his grief. He had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, no family to rely on. His life, the life he had worked so hard to build, was gone, scattered like the rain that pelted the pavement. The world around him seemed to blur as he leaned against a streetlight, the glow of its sickly yellow light casting an eerie glow over the wet streets. His eyes were heavy, his body exhausted from the emotional and physical toll of the past few days. He could feel himself slipping, his mind drifting, his thoughts growing foggy as the cold seeped deeper into his bones. He closed his eyes, not caring that the rain was soaking him further, not caring that the world seemed to pass him by. He was just so tired. So very tired. But then, a voice broke through the haze. "Hey! Are you okay?" James opened his eyes slowly, the voice ringing in his ears like a distant bell. At first, he thought he was imagining it. After all, who would care about an old man sitting on the street in the middle of a storm? But the voice came again, more insistent this time. "Hey, are you all right? You look like you've been out here a while." Through the fog of exhaustion and pain, James finally looked up. Standing before him was a young man, perhaps in his late 20s, wearing a heavy coat and holding an umbrella to shield him from the rain. His face was kind, his eyes filled with genuine concern, and for a brief moment, James felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. James tried to speak, but his throat was dry, his voice cracked from days of crying and wandering. He coughed lightly, trying to clear his throat, but the words didn't come. The young man knelt down in front of him, his expression softening even further as he assessed James's condition. "You're cold," the man said, his voice gentle but firm. "You need to get out of the rain. Come on, let me help you." James barely had the strength to protest. He had no idea who this man was, why he was helping him, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, James didn't feel completely alone. The young man gently helped James to his feet, steadying him as he stumbled, and led him toward a nearby building. "Come on, I'm not far from here," the young man said, his voice reassuring. "Just a little bit further." James didn't resist. His body was weak, his muscles aching from the strain, but the kindness of the stranger was like a lifeline, pulling him forward through the fog of despair. He barely registered the passing scenery as they walked, the steady rhythm of the man's footsteps guiding him. The world felt distant and blurry, but the warmth of the man's presence, his steady hand, gave James something he hadn't had in days: comfort. The man led him to a modest apartment building, the kind of place James might have once driven past without a second thought. It wasn't much, but in that moment, it felt like a sanctuary. The young man helped James inside, closing the door behind them as they stepped into the warmth of a small, cozy living room. It smelled of tea and books, and the soft glow of a few lamps filled the room with a welcoming light. James looked around, taking in the simple furnishings: a worn couch, a bookshelf filled with books, and a small dining table in the corner. It was nothing extravagant, but there was a peacefulness to it that calmed him. "Take a seat," the man said, gesturing to the couch. "I'll get you something to drink." James lowered himself onto the couch, his body aching with exhaustion. He was still dazed, his mind struggling to grasp the reality of what was happening. This stranger, this young man, was offering him shelter, offering him care, when he didn't owe him anything. It was almost too much to comprehend. The man returned moments later with a cup of warm tea, the steam rising gently from the mug. He handed it to James with a kind smile. "Here. This should help warm you up." James took the cup, his hands shaking as he held it. He could feel the warmth seeping into his cold fingers, the heat slowly spreading through his body. For the first time in days, he felt something other than pain. He felt human again. "Thank you," James whispered, his voice hoarse. "I don't know what to say." The young man smiled softly, sitting down across from James. "You don't have to say anything. I just couldn't leave you out there, not in this condition." James took a slow sip of the tea, letting the warmth settle in his chest. The silence between them was comfortable, not awkward. The young man didn't press him for details or ask about his life, he simply allowed James to be. It was a kindness James hadn't experienced in so long, and for a moment, it felt like the world was just a little bit less cruel. As James sat there, drinking the tea, the young man watched him with quiet concern. "You don't have to tell me anything if you don't want to, but I know things can get really tough. If you need someone to talk to, I'm here." James looked at him, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. He had been betrayed by his wife, abandoned by his family, and cast out into the cold. He had lost everything. But sitting in this stranger's apartment, with the warmth of the tea in his hands and the kindness of the man before him, he felt a spark of something. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was just the realization that there was still some good in the world. "Thank you," James said again, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to do. I've lost everything. I don't even know where to go from here." The young man leaned forward, his expression earnest. "It's okay to feel lost. But you're not alone. And things can get better. You just need to take it one step at a time." James nodded, the words sinking in. It seemed so simple, so impossible, yet in this moment, it felt like a possibility. One step at a time. I'm Mark, the young man said, offering a hand. I don't know if I can fix everything for you, but I'll help however I can. James took his hand, a sense of gratitude swelling in his chest. James, he said, his voice steadying. Thank you, Mark. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found me. The two men sat in silence for a while, the quiet companionship offering more solace than words ever could. In the warmth of the apartment, James began to feel a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The days following his arrival at Mark's apartment were a blur. The warmth of the small space, the comforting routine of meals and conversation, began to heal James in ways he hadn't thought possible. The kindness Mark had shown him, taking him in, offering him a safe place when the rest of the world seemed to have turned its back, was more than just shelter. It was a lifeline. Mark had become the anchor that kept James tethered to reality, to the possibility of rebuilding a life that seemed irrevocably broken. But while James began to settle into this fragile new existence, his mind often wandered back to the estate, to Karen and the life he had lost. The memory of that cold night when he had been thrown out, his world shattered in an instant, continued to haunt him. And despite everything Mark had done for him, the bitterness of betrayal still churned deep within him. His body might have been recovering, but his soul had yet to find peace. James didn't talk about his past much. He didn't have to. Mark respected that. But over time, as they spent more time together, Mark began to ask gentle questions. He never pushed, but his curiosity was clear, and James could sense that Mark was trying to understand the full scope of the pain he had endured. One evening, as they sat in the cozy living room, James finally broke the silence. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. About Karen, about everything. Mark, sitting across from him, looked up from his book. You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready. But if you want to, I'm here. James nodded, his gaze distant as he leaned back in his chair. His mind drifted back to that night when the betrayal had first reared its ugly head. The day had started like any other, but by the time it ended, his world had been irrevocably changed. I thought I knew her, James continued, his voice faltering. Karen and I, he paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. We built everything together. We started from nothing, and we built an empire, a family. I trusted her with everything. I never imagined she could do something like this. Mark leaned forward slightly, listening intently. I remember that night so clearly, James said, his eyes glassy with the memory. I walked into that house, expecting to find the warmth of home, but instead, I found her with him. He clenched his fists, the anger rising in his chest once again. That bastard Mark. He was younger than my son, for Christ's sake. And she just threw me out like I was nothing. All the years we spent together, all the sacrifices I made meant nothing to her. It was just about her and him, and the life they could have without me. Mark didn't speak, but his expression softened, and he gave a small nod of understanding. It was clear that James needed to say these things, to get the poison of betrayal out of his system. And Mark, in his quiet way, allowed him the space to do so. She convinced me to sign over everything I worked for, James continued, his voice trembling with rage. She said it was for tax purposes, that it would make things easier for the kids. I trusted her. I thought it was just paperwork, a formality. But now, I see it for what it was, a trap. She wanted it all, and she was willing to lie and manipulate me to get it. James took a deep breath, his fingers trembling as he set the glass of water down on the table in front of him. I signed it, Mark. I signed it all away. And then she tossed me out like I was some piece of trash. I couldn't even say goodbye to the house we built together. I didn't get a chance to even think about what she had done, because it all happened so fast. One moment, I was a husband, a father, and the next, I was nothing. The silence between them was thick, the weight of James's words hanging heavily in the air. Mark didn't say anything for a while. He didn't need to. He understood the pain, the betrayal, the deep sense of helplessness that came with being so thoroughly deceived. James's life had been built on trust. He had built his empire on the belief that loyalty and hard work would pay off. But now, that foundation had been shattered. And as much as he tried to move forward, the past lingered like an unshakable shadow, reminding him of the life he had lost. "Did she ever tell you why?" Mark asked gently. "Why she did it?" James shook his head slowly. "She didn't have to. I know why. It was never about me. It was about her, about what she wanted. She got tired of me. She wanted someone younger, someone who could give her a life of luxury and excitement. I had become too predictable, too old." Mark's eyes were filled with sympathy. "I am sorry, James. No one deserves to be treated like that." James let out a bitter laugh, the sound hollow and bitter. "I don't know what's worse, Mark, the fact that she betrayed me, or the fact that I still loved her after everything. I still thought we could make it work. I thought we could rebuild. But now I don't even know who she is anymore." Mark leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath as he processed James's words. It was clear to him that James was still in the thick of it, still reeling from the impact of the betrayal. It was hard to see the path forward when everything you thought you knew had been torn away. Karen got what she wanted, but at what cost? Mark said after a long pause. "She lost you, James. She lost someone who would have done anything for her, someone who truly cared for her. And in the end, it sounds like she's the one who's lost too." James looked up at Mark, his face a mixture of exhaustion and pain. "Maybe," he murmured. "But that doesn't change what she did. And it doesn't change the fact that I'm left with nothing." Mark nodded, his expression serious. "Maybe, but you still have something. You still have yourself. And you have the chance to rebuild your life. Don't let her define you. Don't let her actions dictate who you are. You're not just the man she left behind. You're a man who still has the chance to move forward." James sat in silence, the words sinking in slowly. Mark's words, though simple, carried weight. It was hard to imagine starting over, but perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way forward. James had been betrayed, but he wasn't defeated. Not yet. There was still a part of him that refused to give in, a part of him that still believed in the possibility of redemption. He had lost his family, his home, his dignity, but maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to rebuild. He had to. For his own sake. As the days passed, the quiet rhythm of life in Mark's apartment became his refuge. He had his moments of anger, of sorrow, of doubt. But each day, he got a little stronger, a little more determined. And with Mark's help, he began to gather the pieces of his shattered life, one small step at a time. But even as he began to heal, he knew one thing for certain: the price of betrayal was high. And Karen would have to pay for it in ways she could never imagine. The question was, how far was James willing to go to make sure she faced the consequences of her actions? That was a question he didn't have the answer to yet. But in time, he would find out. And when the time came, he would be ready to face her, ready to confront the woman who had torn his life apart. But for now, he would focus on healing. One step at a time. James stood on the edge of something new, a new beginning that, in his most vulnerable moments, had seemed almost impossible. The first few weeks of his life in Mark's apartment had felt like a bluer was suspended between despair and hope, between the remnants of a life he no longer recognized and the faint spark of something better. Mark, with his quiet wisdom and unwavering support, had given him the space to heal, but now, the time had come for action. James had spent hours each day reflecting on what had happened. The betrayal, the abandonment, the cruelty, it had all left scars deeper than he cared to admit. But in the stillness of Mark's apartment, away from the life he had once known, he found himself asking questions he hadn't dared to ask before. What was it all for? How could Karen and Mark, the man who had so ruthlessly turned his life upside down, get away with it? As much as he hated to admit it, he had begun to realize that his past wasn't just a life to mourn, it was a weapon. And it was time for him to take control of that weapon, to reclaim what was rightfully his. He had made the decision. He wasn't going to let Karen's treachery, nor Mark's manipulation, slide by unnoticed. The time for healing was over, the time for retribution had arrived. Mark, ever the supportive presence in his life, understood the decision even before James had fully vocalized it. It was as though Mark had been waiting for this moment, when the grief and anger would no longer be all-consuming but would transform into something more focused. He had seen it in James's eyes, the fire of justice rekindled, the desire to fight for what he had lost, to make sure that Karen and Mark would be held accountable for their actions. James had learned from Mark's legal expertise, from the quiet hours they had spent together combing through his old papers, searching for any traces of dishonesty, deceit, or fraud. They had pieced together a story of manipulation, of a wife who had plotted, with cold precision, to take it all from him, and a man who had taken advantage of her vulnerability for his own gain. But there were cracks in the story. Gaps that, if filled correctly, would expose the truth and bring justice. It wasn't just about money. Not anymore. It was about principle. James had been humiliated, betrayed in the worst way possible, but that humiliation had transformed into something else: a quiet strength, a sense of resolve that had eluded him for too long. James sat in the living room one evening, a glass of whiskey in hand, the amber liquid reflecting the dim light of the lamp. Mark had just left for the night, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The file of evidence they had gathered sat in front of him on the coffee table. A thick stack of documents, bank records, text messages, photos from security cameras, each one another piece of the puzzle that was Karen's betrayal. The weight of it all felt heavy, but it was a weight James was willing to carry. It was his burden to bear, his fight to win. He couldn't let this go. Not when he had the means to fight back, not when he knew that the truth could be his weapon. He wouldn't let them destroy everything he had built without facing the consequences. The first step was to contact a private investigator. Mark had a contact, a sharp-eyed investigator named Helen, who specialized in uncovering hidden assets and fraudulent activity. She had worked on corporate fraud cases in the past, helping clients reclaim lost fortunes, and Mark trusted her instincts. Helen had the experience James needed to dig deeper into Karen's financial activities and those of Mark, the younger man who had wormed his way into his wife's life. When James met Helen for the first time, he was struck by her no-nonsense demeanor. She was professional, sharp, and far more confident than he had expected. She wasted no time in getting to work, and within a matter of days, she had begun uncovering new layers of deception that had previously escaped James's attention. Karen didn't just want the house and the investments, James, Helen explained one afternoon as they sat in a small coffee shop, her laptop open in front of her, displaying a series of bank transactions. She was funneling money into a separate account, an offshore one, and then transferring funds under different names. Whoever this man is, he's been involved in more than just taking advantage of you. Has been laundering money through your wife's assets. James's heart sank as Helen's words hit him like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just a matter of a broken marriage, a betrayal. It was criminal. And not just on the part of Karen. The man she had taken up with, Mark, was involved in something far more sinister than James had initially thought. The revelation shook him to his core, but it also fueled a new sense of purpose. He had spent years building his empire, only to see it all torn down in the blink of an eye. But now, with Helen's help, he saw a way forward, a way to not just reclaim what was his, but to bring Karen and Mark to justice for their actions. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. James, with Helen's guidance, worked tirelessly to gather every shred of evidence that could expose Karen's deceit. They traced the money back to Mark's involvement in illegal real estate deals, fraudulent investments, and the offshore accounts. The documents were airtight. Every piece of the puzzle fit together perfectly, revealing the depth of the conspiracy Karen and Mark had orchestrated. They had used James's trust, his love for his wife, to rob him blind. But James wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. It was time for the final confrontation. James stood in the grand courtroom, the walls of which seemed to press in on him as he faced the judge. His lawyer, a seasoned professional, sat beside him, going over the final details. The evidence they had gathered was overwhelming. Karen and Mark had no chance. The money, the documents, the photos, they all pointed to one undeniable truth. They had colluded to defraud him, to take everything from him with calculated precision. Karen sat across the room, her face pale and drawn, her eyes darting nervously between the judge and her lawyer. Mark, ever the arrogant fool, sat beside her, his demeanor confident but strained. He had no idea what was coming. No idea that the truth was about to come crashing down on him. The prosecutor called James to the stand, and as he walked up to testify, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about getting back what was his. It was about reclaiming his dignity, his sense of self, his place in a world that had nearly abandoned him. It was about showing Karen and Mark that they couldn't get away with it. "Mr. Harrison," the prosecutor began, his voice steady and professional, "can you tell the court what you've discovered about the financial dealings of your wife and her associate?" James cleared his throat, steadying himself. "I've discovered that my wife, Karen, and Mark," he paused, his voice catching slightly as he looked at the man who had been a part of his life for so long, "have been involved in fraudulent activities. They've been laundering money through offshore accounts, hiding assets, and manipulating me into signing over my property under false pretenses." The courtroom was silent as James's words hung in the air, the gravity of the situation sinking in. He looked across the room at Karen, her face now pale and stricken, and then at Mark, who was sweating, his usual bravado slipping away. The evidence was irrefutable, and James could see the shock in their eyes as they realized the weight of their betrayal had been exposed. The judge, after reviewing the evidence, stood and addressed the room. "Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, the court finds the defendants guilty of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to defraud Mr. Harrison. The sentence will be determined at the next hearing." James sat back in his chair, his heart pounding. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had regained some measure of control. This was his victory. This was the justice he had sought, the revenge that had been long overdue. As he left the courtroom, he glanced at Mark and Karen one last time. They were defeated, broken, and James knew that the battle was won. But even as he walked away from the courtroom, he knew that it was not the end for him. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could breathe again. He had won. And that was just the beginning. The days following the trial were an endless blur of press conferences, legal proceedings, and personal reflection. The courtroom had been a battleground, but for James, it was only the first step in what would become the long road toward healing. Mark had been arrested, his involvement in the fraudulent schemes finally exposed, and Karen, her betrayal laid bare, had been forced to face the consequences of her actions. The emotional toll of it all weighed on James, but now, for the first time in a long while, he felt something resembling peace. The verdict had been swift and final. Mark was sentenced to a lengthy prison term for his crimes, while Karen faced a hefty fine and restitution payments, though her future was uncertain. The press had swarmed the courthouse, capturing every moment of the proceedings. The media had painted the story of a wealthy businessman betrayed by his wife and her lover, turning it into a public spectacle. But for James, the public eye had lost its relevance. The truth had been revealed, and justice had been served, but there was still something else, something more profound that he had to reckon with. James spent the weeks after the trial in a state of quiet contemplation. The weight of everything that had transpired hung over him like a storm cloud, but he knew deep down that it was time to begin the work of rebuilding not just his empire, but his heart. He had reclaimed his assets, and the house that had once been a symbol of his love and trust in Karen was now his again. But more than that, he had to rebuild himself, his sense of self-worth, his dignity, his purpose. The city, which had once felt like a cruel reminder of his fall from grace, now seemed more like a place of possibility. He walked through the streets, no longer a shadow of himself, but a man who had weathered the storm. And it wasn't just the physical possessions he had recovered, it was the strength of his spirit. He was no longer bound by the pain of betrayal. Instead, he had found a way to transform that pain into something far more powerful: resilience. James had found new meaning in the quiet, simple things. Every morning, he would take long walks around the city, just for the sake of walking. He would stop by a park and watch the children play, the laughter of the young reminding him that life continued, regardless of the storms that came and went. In the evenings, he would sit in his study, the same study where he had once signed away his life, now a place of quiet reflection. His hand still trembled when he picked up a pen, but it wasn't out of fear, Anna Maria, it was out of gratitude. Gratitude for the chance to begin again. It was one evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, that James received an unexpected call. He had known, deep down, that this moment was coming. He had spent so many nights wondering if Karen would ever reach out to him, if she would ever try to make amends. He had told himself over and over that he didn't care, that he had moved on and that the past was nothing more than a shadow. But when the phone rang, his heart skipped a beat. It was Karen. James, her voice crackled on the other end, sounding older, more fragile than he remembered. "I know you don't want to hear from me. I don't even know why I'm calling, but I need to speak to you. Please. Can we meet?" For a moment, he was silent. The anger and bitterness that had once consumed him flared briefly in his chest, but it quickly subsided. He had already gone through the process of letting go, of forgiving her not because she deserved it, but because he deserved to find peace. "Where?" he asked, his voice steady. "Can we meet at the old house?" she asked, her voice trembling. James hesitated. The thought of returning to the house, the very place where his life had unraveled, filled him with a mix of emotions. But he knew, deep down, that this was a conversation he needed to have. It wasn't just for her, it was for him. It was the final piece of the puzzle that would allow him to close this chapter of his life, to release the last remnants of the past that had held him captive. The drive to the estate felt surreal. The familiar streets passed by in a blur, the places he had once visited with Karen now alien, like they belonged to someone else. When he arrived at the house, it seemed smaller than he remembered, as though the years had robbed it of some of its grandeur. The trees in the yard were overgrown, the paint on the house peeling. The once pristine home now felt like a relic of a past life, a life that had ended the day Karen had betrayed him. Karen was waiting for him on the porch, her figure silhouetted against the fading light of the setting sun. She looked different, older, more fragile. The woman he had once known, the woman he had shared his life with, was gone. In her place stood a stranger, someone who had been shaped by time and regret. Her hair, once lustrous and full, was now streaked with gray, and her eyes, which had once been so full of warmth and love, now seemed empty, haunted by the weight of her choices. She stood up when she saw him, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them stretched, thick and uncomfortable, as if the years of betrayal and resentment still clung to the air around them. "I didn't know what to say to you," Karen said finally, her voice soft, almost pleading. "I didn't know how to make things right. I've made so many mistakes, James. I've hurt you in ways I can never take back, and too am sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need you to know that I'm sorry." James looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, he saw her as she was vulnerable, regretful, and broken. He had spent so much time hating her, so much time replaying the betrayal over and over in his mind, but now, standing in front of her, he realized something. The woman who had betrayed him was not the same woman who stood before him now. Time had worn her down, just as it had worn him down. She had lost everything too. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Karen," James said, his voice steady but not unkind. "But I can tell you this: I've forgiven myself. I've spent so long holding on to the anger and the hurt, thinking it was what I needed to feel better, but all it did was keep me chained to the past. I've let go of that now." Karen's eyes filled with tears, and she wiped them away hastily. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But I'm glad you've found peace." James took a deep breath, the weight of the past few months pressing down on him. "I don't know what the future holds for either of us, Karen," he said quietly. "But I think we both need to move forward, in our own ways. I can undo what you did, and you can undo what I did. But we can both choose to be better, to not be defined by the mistakes we made." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden light over the two of them as they stood there, silently watching the day fade into night. The sky was painted with shades of pink and purple, a beautiful, quiet reminder that even after the darkest of storms, there was still beauty to be found. "I hope you find what you're looking for, James," Karen said softly. "And you, Karen," he replied, his voice steady, calm. "I hope you do too." They stood there for a moment longer, the world around them peaceful, as if nature itself had granted them this fleeting moment of reconciliation. And as the sun finally disappeared, the weight of the past lifted just a little more, leaving behind only the promise of a new beginning, a new chapter. James turned to leave, his heart lighter than it had been in months. He had found peace, not in the restitution of his wealth or the legal victory he had won, but in the quiet forgiveness he had granted himself and the possibility of a future free from the chains of the past. As he drove away from the house for the last time, he glanced in the rearview mirror, his gaze lingering on the fading silhouette of the woman who had once been his world. He didn't need to look back anymore. The road ahead was clear. And as the sunset faded into the night, James knew that, for the first time in a long time, he was free.